moving from a sedentary to a physically active societal way of life. This is Up on Our Feet.
Welcome to Up on Our Feet. There have been many studies and published research papers on how physical activity enhances the academic performance of students. In great scientific detail, these papers explain just how physical activity positively impacts learning. And for the most part, these studies and papers are intended for other researchers and to inform education policymakers and officials. But as we also saw in our previous episode of Up on Our Feet, every once in a while, a different kind of study and related research paper comes out that looks at things from a different point of view. And this is the case with a study that was conducted and related paper published a few years ago that from a very simple perspective provided the reactions in both words and hand-drawn images of elementary or primary age students to their experiencing the integration of physical activity into their academic classroom learning environment. The study was conducted in Ireland and was headed up by Professor Jaimie McMullen. Professor McMullen is now in the Department of Kinesiology and Rehabilitation Science at the University of Hawai'i at Manoa and continues to work remotely as an associate professor at the University of Northern Colorado. But it was when she was a lecturer in physical education and sports sciences at the University of Limerick in Ireland that she led the study on students' reactions to their experience of physical activity integrated into their academic classroom environment. Professor McMullen, it's nice to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk about this with you today.
Good. All right. Thank you. So this is such an interesting and enjoyable study to read. How did you even come up with the idea to do this kind of a study?
Yeah, so I think for me, I've always been interested in qualitative methodology ever since I was a graduate student and thinking about how we can learn more about participants' voices. And I think that quantitative research is really important and learning things, as you mentioned before, about physical activity levels and connections with learning and things. But I also think that it's important for us to learn from the people who are experiencing the initiatives that we plan as researchers within the school, whether it's teachers or students or other key informants or stakeholders. And so I started working with elementary students, and sometimes talking to elementary students, you get some really interesting responses. I've had some really interesting comments made in interviews and things. But they're also really creative and they want to express their feelings in multiple ways. And so using the writing, using the drawings was something that I had seen in previous research, not necessarily in the classroom physical activity space, but some in physical education and other areas. And so that was really the impetus for including the drawings, was another way for young people to be able to express their emotions or their feelings about a particular activity, in this case, movement integration or movement in the classroom, in a way that is meaningful to them, that they can really express themselves. So I think that's really where the idea for this type of methodology came up from, was wanting to learn more from our participants and thinking about ways that we can elicit those responses a little bit differently than just through the traditional interview format.
Okay. And the program, the movement program, is called Moving to Learn Ireland. How did it come about and what does it entail?
Yeah, so previous to the work that I've done with students, I had done quite a bit of work, not only in Europe, but also in the United States around teachers' perceptions of physical activity in the classroom. And one of the things that we sort of found was that lessons or activities that were highly contextualized and connected strongly with content, for example, were most valued by teachers. And so when we started to develop the Moving to Learn Ireland program, we were obviously working in Ireland. There were two of my colleagues that helped, who are acknowledged in the paper that we're talking about today, that helped develop the curriculum, are both from Ireland, grew up, born and raised in Ireland, and also they do primary physical education work in Ireland. And so we started talking about how movement integration, a lot of the lessons, the prepackaged lessons, and even there's lots of videos online and things like that that teachers can use, Go Noodle and different things like that, are situated in an American context. They're situated within the United States and don't always translate contextually. So we thought, why not, sit down with some teachers, and we did have input from teachers in Ireland, and create these lessons that actually connect to the three core subjects in primary schools in Ireland. So it's English, Irish, and maths, and create these lessons that were specific to the outcomes and standards of those subject areas, but then also made sense within the Irish context. So they weren't necessarily these American lessons that were coming in and trying to do, that they were created for Irish teachers, by Irish teachers, and connected to the curriculum in Ireland. So that was really important, and informed again from previous work that I've done with teachers, that they want movement activities that are connected to content because they have a lot to do in their day. And I think a lot of teachers see taking time for physical activity as sort of not a waste of time, but time that they could spend in other academic subjects or within academic subjects. So connecting it with the academic content was important from the previous work that we've found, and then also making it contextual or connected with their sort of environment. So again, this notion of using terms that make sense within the Irish context that wouldn't necessarily be used within the American context. And then of course, we have an entire section of the curriculum that was developed in Irish for the Irish lessons. So I did not develop those lessons, my colleague did, but that was really important as well, was having those things that they could see themselves in the curriculum to do those, to do those lessons.
Okay. What was so uplifting in the study was the students' verbal reactions to the program. So would you describe some of the students' reactions?
Yeah, it's maybe not surprising in some ways, right? The kids want to move. I think I come from the philosophy that most people want to move. Most of us don't want to sit around all day and be sedentary, even though our society has really kind of forced us into those types of jobs, especially, if we think about 100 years ago, there was a lot more physical labor jobs and things that people did. So it's not surprising to me that the kids responded positively to the movement in and of itself, because I do think that if you give kids an opportunity to play, and even adults an opportunity to play, people want to play, right? They want to move and be active. I also come from the philosophy that active kids do better. You mentioned the connection to learning. We didn't measure that in this study. And, the evidence really is mixed, that there's not these huge learning gains, but there's also not losses if you replace learning time with physical activity. So I think the thing that maybe surprised me the most was the connections that the students themselves made to learning with the moving. I wasn't surprised that they found it fun. And I wasn't super surprised that they linked it with exercise and becoming more fit and things like that, because I think the teachers kind of promoted that within the lessons. But when they were talking about, there's quotes in the paper about the boring way of learning, for example, and they're talking about sitting at a desk and learning, how 99.9% of kids across the world, not just in Ireland, in the United States and Canada and Australia and everywhere, we sit in desks and we teach kids subjects, right? And so they kept referring to that as the boring way of learning or the normal way of learning, and that this was so much more fun. And obviously there could be a novelty aspect to that, right? So had we gone back 2 years later and the teachers were still doing the lessons, would they have reacted in the same way? I'm not sure. We didn't do that work. But I think there's a novelty to it, and it was something that they definitely appreciated. And so I think those things, when they would talk about things like the boring way of learning, I know I've said it a couple times, but to me, that's probably the funniest comment of the students, because it's very honest, right? Like, they're bored in school. They don't want to sit in a desk all day, just the same that you or I don't want to be sitting at a desk all day. So I think that was a key highlight for me when I was doing the interviews. And of course, as I just said, kids are so honest. And so things that come out of their mouths, sometimes it takes a second to remember that you're doing a research project, and you have to kind of keep focused because they say really funny things. So that was interesting.
In this context, the title of the paper starts off with one of the quotes from the students, and the quote is, "I want to do it all day."
Mm-hmm.
And so, do you remember the student who said that, and what that was about for him or her?
Yeah, it was a young boy who made that comment, and it was so funny because he was the type of student that, for anyone who's ever spent time in schools or around kids, he couldn't quite sit still. And even in the interview format, he was shifting around, and we were sitting actually on a floor, crisscross kind of applesauce in a circle, and he kept moving to his knees and switching to this side and that side. And so I wasn't surprised when he said that he wanted to do it all day, and he was talking about the movement, obviously, because he clearly was one of those students who really benefits from that. I mean, they're kids and humans in general, we're not made to be sedentary for as much time as we are. And yet we continuously put kids like in these desks, and you have to sit still and concentrate and all of those things. And there was another student who actually said that they can't concentrate when they're sitting still in their desk. And so this idea, right, that the only way students can learn and the only way they can concentrate is if they're still and sitting and not moving and not talking to anyone and all of those kinds of things, was sort of really debunked by the students in this study in particular. So yes, I do remember the student, to go back to your original question, and I was not surprised because he looked probably like I looked in elementary school, and, always wanting to be moving and not wanting to sit still.
So in a sense, he was figuratively and literally a poster child for the program.
Absolutely. And I think that even teachers, classroom teachers don't necessarily want kids to be sitting all day long either. Yet our environments are built in that way, right? The classroom environment, the traditional classroom environment, does not facilitate moving. And if you go based off of the previous comments, maybe learning either, right? So there's a lot more teachers that are trying flexible classroom spaces, with exercise balls and different things, options for kids for seating. But typically, 95+% of the classrooms that you're going to walk into globally, internationally, are going to have rows of desks or pods of desks, and not a lot of space for movement in classrooms. So not only is kind of our practices haven't traditionally supported movement in the classroom, but the environment itself doesn't necessarily support that type of movement either.
Okay, so this was in the context of the kids' verbal reactions, and you also mentioned, and I did too in the intro, about the hand drawings. Mm-hmm. What came out in the hand drawings? What caught your attention there?
Yeah, it was interesting because I think it's super clear there were certain teachers that probably did certain activities more so than others, because we definitely saw themes within classrooms of them depicting themselves doing specific lessons. I also know, because we were there observing, that some of the teachers had just done a movement lesson right before we did the drawings. So there was potentially, some influence there from the classroom teachers in what students were drawing. But the prompt that they were given was to draw themselves doing an active English, Irish, or math lesson, and then write a few sentences to tell us how they felt. And so it was, kids, I'm a terrible artist. I am not creative at all with those kinds of things, but the creativity with some of the kids, and even the kids that just did the stick figures but then wrote a couple of sentences that were really interesting, it kind of allowed them this opportunity to really express sort of how they felt. And we didn't say, draw yourself happy doing these lessons. We just said, draw yourself doing these lessons. So there was no prompting to make it a positive thing. And there was not one frowning face in the whole 135 drawings that we collected. Most of them were themselves participating with their classmates, with their peers, which is also another interesting aspect, because again, I think learning in a classroom is often a very isolating experience. You're sitting at your desk doing your work and not necessarily having that social aspect. So the movement lessons also integrated some of that socializing, some of those socializing aspects. So I think the drawings were just so fun to look at their creativity in general, but then also to see how they interpreted the different lessons and the sentences that they wrote. So it was a write draw. The sentences that they wrote were also really interesting, but little things, and it's in the paper, it's accounted for. I had a colleague there with me who was taking notes and was asking them, we would ask them certain questions about their drawings because we didn't want to misinterpret what they had on them. So there was one drawing that a child literally looked like a Dalmatian. They had spots all over their face. And we're like, what is that? And they're like, oh, that's our sweat. And so it was like, oh, okay. And we would have never known that if we wouldn't have asked, right, what it was. And, there was one class where, one kid said squishy instead of sweaty. So then all of the kids started writing squishy. This was a very young group of kids. And so they all started writing squishy instead of sweaty, which was kind of funny, but also really came out of them being influenced by each other because they were sitting kind of at tables doing these things. So I think for me, just looking at their creativity and the overall sort of positivity that came out in the drawings, I think was really refreshing, that you could see the enjoyment that the kids had, even for the students that didn't participate in the focus groups and weren't able to share that verbally with us. You could see it through the drawings. And we had some really good artists in there. It was, some of these could be hung in the Louvre, maybe, right? So anyways, maybe not.
That's okay, right? Potentially hung in the Louvre.
Yes.
Okay, so you just gave the verbal reactions. You just talked about the hand drawings. When you saw these and saw the drawings and heard the reactions, what was your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, obviously when we're doing research, right, we hope that it has a positive outcome, a positive impact. And so I think for me, as someone who I would have loved to have this kind of program when I was, a student in K-12 schooling, I think there's always encouragement with it, that the fact that what you've created and what you've tried to implement is a positive thing for young people and that they're enjoying it. Because what we did learn from the teachers' perceptions work that I've done on this project, but then also previous work in the United States, was that at the end of the day, teachers want students to enjoy what they're doing, especially things that are maybe they consider supplemental and not necessarily part of the kind of typical way that they would teach. And so we wanted to make sure that what was created was fun, because if students enjoy it, then the teachers are more likely to continue to implement the lessons. We did see that there were some lessons that the students didn't enjoy as much, and they're not depicted in the drawings, for example, or they were things that the teachers had told us in the previous study that the students didn't connect necessarily with the activities. And so they wouldn't do them as frequently. And so I think that that's something to kind of take away from this, is like, we need to know from kids like what they like to do and why they like to do those things in order to be able to create better resources for teachers, for them to implement in their classes, because no one wants to do anything that isn't fun at the end of the day, and teachers don't want to, impose something on their students that they're not going to enjoy.
Okay, so given the verbal and hand-drawn reactions of the students that you just talked about in your reaction, you were reacting as a human being to these things. What about from an overarching, comprehensive perspective as a researcher? What do you think the kids were saying about their classroom learning experience and moving to learn, if they were researchers themselves or adults and were articulating? What do you think's behind what their reactions were?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, and I do think that it's important to note the novelty, right? Because none of the teachers that were involved in our project were teachers who previously incorporated movement in their classrooms. So the students had, recess and physical education and things like that, but they sat in their classrooms. So, and that is evident in the results, right? They talk about, we sit all day long, we're sitting in our desks, we're not doing anything, we're not moving, we want to do that more, right? So I think that there's a novelty aspect to it, probably for the teachers and the students, that it was different. It was a new kind of way. I think one of the students refers to this new way of learning, which is interesting. So I think the novelty piece, I think, is definitely something to kind of take into account. But I do think that, we have to start thinking about ways to engage students, and kids are in school for a long part of their waking hours, right? They're in school for a long time, and other work that I've done shows that the majority of that time, is spent sedentary. And a lot of kids, even in recess and their lunch hour and physical education, don't get as much physical activity as we think that they get. So teachers will often say, oh, well, they just had recess, they don't need to be active again. But there's, research on physical activity levels that show that there's a lot of kids that just sit and, pick daisies, or, I mean, I'm paraphrasing and insinuating here, but that sit and don't do a lot of physical activity during those break times. And so the misconception that kids are really active outside of the classroom is not always true. And I think kids nowadays too, a lot of them go home, and there's a rather long quote from one of the girls in the fifth class. And she talks about how there's a big discrepancy in her classmates of kids who are, active and sporty, and then kids that are less fit and less sporty and athletic. And she refers to the gap and how you can really see it on the playground and in physical education, this sort of, that some kids get wheezy really fast, I think is the term that she uses, right? So they get out of breath really fast. And then you have the other kids that are really athletic. And so she actually connected the movement lessons to allowing her peers who are less sporty and less athletic to become less wheezy, less out of breath, right? Because they're exercising. And I think, at the end of the day, kids want to play together. They want to be active. They want to be in those environments, and they want everyone to feel comfortable participating. And I thought it was so wise for about a 10-year-old to, refer to this gap in fitness levels that she sees amongst her peers. And so, I think there's so many things that schools could be doing better and differently to become more active places, because they really are sedentary places to be for the most part. And so if incorporating, one or two 10 to 15-minute active lessons a day is going to help with some of those aspects of making kids sit less and giving them more opportunities to move and to get their blood flowing and their endorphins pumping and all of those things. I think despite the potential benefits that it might have on academics and all of those things, the movement in and of itself is a benefit, for young people. And I would argue if the teachers are doing it with them, for the teachers as well, right? Because while they are standing up a lot of the day and kind of moving around, they're not necessarily active in those same ways as well when they're teaching.
All right. So related to this, why do you think schools everywhere, given what you're talking about, the kids' reactions, the research and everything, why do you think schools everywhere continue to operate in a basically sedentary way of learning? I think you said, 99, and I'm sure it's 99 point whatever, right? Sedentary way of learning, meaning the kids usually sit at their desks to learn, instead of integrating physical activity into the learning experience. Why do they do that, given, there's just so much evidence and research about this?
Yeah, I mean, gosh. And of course, like my percentages that I'm throwing out are not based in facts, right? They're my own interpretations and anecdotal evidence of how I observe schools when I go out into schools. But I think, there's so many factors, right? Elementary teachers, classroom teachers, and I shouldn't even just say elementary because we've done some of this work in secondary levels too, but K-12 teachers are not necessarily trained or taught to integrate movement. I think it's something that's mentioned in teacher preparation programs. Oh, like get kids up and moving, get them active, but they're not necessarily trained how to do that. And, I come from a physical education background, right? I was taught to manage movement. Managing movement is a complex skill, and it's something that not everyone knows how to do very well. So, providing safety guidelines and making sure that if they are moving around in the classroom, that they're not going to hurt themselves. And so the curriculum itself actually encourages teachers to start with like what we call desk side activities. So activities where kids are up out of their seats and they're going to be moving a little bit, but they're not necessarily moving around the classroom. And then it kind of scaffolds up. And I think the other thing to say is that we're not necessarily trying to promote like moderate to vigorous physical activity in the classroom, because again, it's not necessarily the safest space to have kids sprinting around the place, right? So we're just trying to get some movement out of them. And I think it's hard in the environments that they're in. I know of teachers who have gone to a flexible classroom seating arrangement, for example, that had to, do the fundraising themselves to get the exercise balls or the wobble stools or those kinds of things because it's not within the school's budget. And so I think that anything that is kind of a drastic change, which this is, right? We're suggesting organizing the classroom differently, presenting content differently, takes time and resources, oftentimes, money or professional development and things that aren't always available to all teachers. And so I think that that's the biggest barrier, is sort of that the context of the school persists and it doesn't really encourage that kind of engagement and physical activity in the classroom. And I also think that there is sort of this myth, right, that if I end my math lesson 15 minutes early to do a movement integration lesson, then I'm somehow taking away from my students' learning. And so connecting it with the content, I think, is always important for teachers to kind of see. You don't have to like stop the math lesson. You can actually just incorporate physical activity into what you're doing. And I think there are a lot of teachers that do this well, right? So they have transitions between stations and different things in their classroom where kids are moving. So I don't want to say that like all teachers everywhere are locking kids in their desk and they're not able to move, because I don't think that's really the reality. But I think the planned, purposeful movement of, for example, movement integration which again, I refer to in the paper as really connected to academic content and not necessarily just a break, right? Is something that's not well facilitated within the environments that we see in, particularly in American schools, but really across the world.
Okay. Final question. Over the course of your professional career, and with all the studies and projects you've done regarding the positive impact of movement, physical activity in the learning environment of school children, in the big picture of things, what's the big message, the big takeaway, the major conclusion you've come to?
It's a great question. So I always go with the catchphrase, right? Active kids do better. I strongly believe that. And I'm not just talking about, as I mentioned earlier, the academics and things. I think active kids are nicer kids. They are more confident kids. They are happier kids. They're healthier kids. So I think, active kids do better, and schools are a place where most kids by law have to be, for a certain amount of hours per day, per week. And so finding ways that we can create more active culture within schools is going to make kids do better on so many levels, including potentially academics, right? But all of these other things that are so important. And we know we're in a time and a place right now where, we're emphasizing social emotional learning and all of these kinds of things that connect with kids' overall well-being. And being physically active, having fun with your friends through movement is another way that we can positively impact the growth and development of young people. So I think that would be kind of my final message, is sort of how can we find ways to make schools more physically active places to be, and really integrate physical activity into the culture and the kind of fiber of the school as much as possible.
Okay. Professor Jaimie McMullen of the University of Hawai'i at Manoa, thanks for being with us on Up on Our Feet.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.